Hana thought she was chasing a scam until the iron gates opened by themselves. Inside the mansion, hundreds of portraits hung in perfect silence, and one of them was her mother. Not a painting. Not a memory. A photo that felt warm to the touch, pulsing like a heartbeat. Then Hana noticed the eyes in the photo shift, like someone trapped behind glass was watching her back. And at the end of the corridor, a man in black stood waiting, so still, so powerful, the entire house seemed to bow. Hana came for answers. She found a prison. And she realized she might be the key. Hana learned early that poverty was not only lack of money, it was lack of space, lack of time, lack of safety. It was a life measured by narrow margins where one missed paycheck could collapse everything, where a small fever meant the choice between medicine and rent, where the city's noise never truly stopped but somehow never heard you. Hana lived in a one-room apartment above a shop that closed late and opened early, so the building never fully slept. The walls carried cooking smells from neighbors, cigarette smoke from the stairwell, and dampness that clung to winter air. Her mother used to fight that dampness with open windows even in cold weather, wiping condensation from the glass as if clearing the world's fog could keep their lives from blurring. Her mother had been the steady axis of Hana's life. Not a dramatic woman, not someone who demanded attention, but someone whose kindness was disciplined, practical, and fierce in its quiet way. She packed lunch with whatever they had, folded Hana's school uniform with exact corners, and smoothed Hana's hair with hands that always seemed a little tired. If she had fears, she hid them behind routine. If she carried secrets, she locked them behind ordinary language. Then, 2 years ago, her mother vanished. At first Hana believed it was a mistake in time, the kind of delay a phone call could explain. Then hours became a night, the night became a morning, and the morning became a day full of wrong silence. The kettle stayed cold. The laundry remained half-folded. The small plant by the window drooped because no one remembered to water it. Hana reported it to the police and was met with the familiar impatience reserved for people without influence. She printed flyers, asked shopkeepers, waited near subway exits, walked through areas she had avoided all her life because she had no choice. She learned how quickly the city could swallow someone and how quickly others accepted the swallowing as normal. Over time, Hana's hope changed. It stopped looking like optimism and started looking like refusal. A refusal to let the world be done with her mother just because the world preferred clean endings. Hana stopped thinking in weeks and started thinking in patterns: which neighborhoods had cameras, which streets were dark, which shelters rotated staff, which hospitals changed shifts. She listened to rumors. She scanned faces. She kept moving even when her body begged her to stop. The one thing she carried everywhere was a photograph. It was small and worn from being handled too often. Her mother in her 20s, hair tied back, the hint of a smile that wasn't cheerful but steady. The photo had been taken in a place Hana couldn't identify, with a background that looked too elegant for their life. In the bottom corner, barely visible, was a crest stamped in silver ink. It was sharp and symmetrical like a snowflake carved out of metal, but not delicate. It looked like a symbol designed to cut. When Hana was a child, she once asked her mother about that crest. Her mother's face had gone still in a way Hana didn't understand then. She had taken the photo away, held Hana's small wrist between her fingers, and traced an invisible shape on Hana's skin. She told Hana never to show that symbol if it ever appeared on her own body. She told her never to trust a stranger who spoke too softly. She told her to avoid houses that felt too quiet. Then she replaced that fear with a smile and returned to normal life as if nothing had happened. Hana had filed the memory away with other childhood fragments that didn't fit. She had assumed it was superstition. People who struggled sometimes built their own myths to explain the dangers they couldn't name. Then a letter arrived, and the myth stepped into the room like a living thing. It came on a gray winter afternoon when the sunlight seemed too weak to matter. The envelope was thick, the paper heavy, the seal wax so dark it looked almost black. Hana's name was written in careful strokes, not rushed, not casual, as if it belonged to a list of names that mattered. There was no return address. There was no stamp. Hana didn't know how it had reached her mailbox at all. Inside was a single card. On it was an address and a short instruction: come alone. Bring proof. No greeting. No explanation. No signature. Hana read it again and again, hoping the words would rearrange into sense. But the address remained fixed. It belonged to the oldest district of the city, the part where stone buildings pressed close to narrow streets, where tourists came in daylight for photos and locals avoided at night. Hana had passed through it sometimes on buses and always felt her eyes slide away from one particular place without knowing why: a mansion surrounded by iron gates and winter-bare trees, hidden in plain sight by the way people collectively chose not to notice it. The mansion had never made sense as part of the city. It looked like something planted from another era, too grand, too quiet, too certain it didn't have to belong. Hana remembered how the bus windows always reflected something over it, how her attention always drifted at the exact moment she passed it, as if her mind refused to record it. Now the address forced her to see it. Hana told herself it could be a scam. Someone could have learned her mother disappeared and decided to prey on her desperation. That happened to people like her all the time. But the seal on the envelope, the weight of the paper, the cold precision of the handwriting, none of it felt like an ordinary trick. She stared at the photograph again. The silver crest in the corner looked sharper than before. She decided that fear was not an argument anymore. Fear had already lived with her for 2 years. If this was danger, she would meet it. If it was cruelty, she would survive it. If it was a lie, at least it would be a lie she had confronted instead of a mystery that ate her alive. She left before nightfall, dressed in her warmest coat, the photo pressed in the inner pocket near her heart. As she walked, the city around her felt unchanged: shops, traffic, people hurrying with groceries, but Hana felt as if she were moving out of the visible world and into a scene where reality stitched into something else. The old district was colder. The air smelled like stone and winter water. The streets narrowed. The buildings leaned inward. Hana's footsteps sounded too loud. When she reached the mansion's gates, she stopped. The iron bars were tall and black, topped with sharp points. Behind them, a path of dark stone ran between bare trees. The mansion itself rose at the end, too large, too still, like a shadow that had decided to become solid. Hana expected a guard, a camera, a sign. There was nothing. Only quiet. She lifted her hand toward the gate. Before her fingers touched the metal, the gate opened. It swung inward smoothly, silently, as if it had been waiting for her. Hana froze, her breath catching in her throat. She looked up and down the street for anyone watching. No one seemed to notice. A couple walked past without turning their heads, as if an iron gate opening by itself was invisible. Hana stepped through, and the gate closed behind her with the same silent obedience. The path felt longer than it looked. The trees on either side were too still, their bare branches forming an arch that reminded Hana of ribs. The mansion didn't grow larger as she approached, it seemed to maintain a fixed distance until suddenly she was at the front doors. The stone under her feet was cold enough that it felt like it was pulling heat out of her body. A man appeared at the entrance as if he had stepped out of the shadow of the doorframe. He wore a black suit, perfectly fitted. His face was pale, his expression neutral, his eyes steady. He did not smile. He did not frown. He simply looked at Hana as if her presence was expected and measured. Hana held out the card. Her hand trembled. The man took it, glanced at it, then looked at Hana's pocket. Hana pulled out the photo and placed it in his hand. The moment his eyes landed on the silver crest, something changed. It was subtle, a tightening of his jaw, a shift in his posture, a fraction of tension in his shoulders. He returned the photo carefully, like it was dangerous, and stepped aside. The massive doors behind him opened inward without him touching them. Hana walked into warmth that did not comfort. The interior smelled of cedar and wax and something metallic beneath, like old coins. The ceiling was high, the walls dark wood and stone. Light came from chandeliers and lamps, but the light seemed restrained, as if brightness was forbidden. Sound felt absorbed. Hana's breathing sounded too loud in her own ears. A long corridor stretched ahead, lined with portraits in heavy frames. At first Hannah's eyes slid over them in a blur, faces of men and women, elegant clothing, pale expressions. Then she took a step and her body stopped so abruptly she almost stumbled. Halfway down the corridor was her mother's face. Hannah's throat closed. Her vision narrowed to that one frame. She moved toward it slowly, as if approaching a wild animal that might vanish if startled. The photograph was crisp and clear. Her mother looked older than in Hannah's worn picture, but unmistakably the same. The frame's metal edges were etched with strange symbols, and in its corner was the same snowflake crest. Hannah raised her hand. The glass was thick, polished, flawless. Yet when Hannah's fingertips touched it, it felt warm. Not warm like a room warmed by fire, but warm like skin warmed by life. Hannah pulled back, stunned. She touched it again, pressing more firmly. Beneath the warmth was a pulse. Slow. Steady. Like a heartbeat beneath water. Hannah's knees weakened. She leaned closer, staring into her mother's eyes. The longer she looked, the more she noticed something impossible. The light in those eyes shifted slightly, as if the gaze behind the photo was aware of being watched. The expression held tension, not flat stillness. Hannah's mouth opened. No sound came. The corridor felt too heavy for words. Behind her, footsteps approached. Quiet. Controlled. The sound of someone who did not hurry because time belonged to them. Hannah turned. A tall figure stood at the far end of the corridor near a doorway that led into darker rooms beyond. He wore black that looked older than modern clothing, as if it belonged to a tradition rather than a style. His hair was dark. His face was still, carved from restraint. His eyes held depth instead of reflection, like shadows that had learned to look back. The air changed around him, thickening, tightening. The portrait's quiet humming, which Hannah hadn't noticed until now, seemed to lower as if in submission. Hannah knew without being told. This was the Vampire King. Not a story whispered by children. Not a myth. A presence that made Hannah's skin prickle and her instincts scream. His gaze moved from Hannah to the frame, then back. Something like recognition sharpened his attention. Something like regret followed behind it, a shadow beneath his stillness. Hannah looked back at her mother's photo. The warmth remained. The pulse remained. The corridor felt like it was holding its breath. Hannah realized the unbelievable truth before anyone explained it. Her mother was not only remembered here. Her mother was here. Trapped inside the frame, alive in some form, sealed behind glass in a mansion built to keep secrets from the sun. And Hannah, holding a worn photo like a key, had walked into the one place in the city that had been waiting for her all along. Hannah did not remember leaving the corridor. Her mind stayed pressed against the frame like her palm against the warm glass, but her body was guided away with quiet insistence. The pale man in the black suit, the steward, appeared beside her as if he had always been there. He did not touch her, yet Hannah felt directed, contained, moved along a path she did not choose. The mansion's silence made every footstep feel like a confession. They passed doors that looked too heavy for ordinary rooms. They passed tall mirrors that reflected Hannah's small figure like an intruder. They passed a staircase that curved upward into darker floors where the air seemed colder. Hannah tried to memorize the layout, but the mansion resisted memory. Corridors angled subtly, and rooms opened at unexpected points like the building was designed to confuse anyone who did not belong. The steward led her into a smaller sitting room near an inner courtyard. A fire burned behind a screen, but the warmth did not soften the room's atmosphere. Candles flickered in steady holders. Furniture sat arranged as if waiting for guests who would never relax. A cup of something hot was placed on a table, and the steward withdrew without explanation. The door closed with a soft click that sounded final. Hannah stood, unable to sit. Her hands shook. Her mind replayed the pulse beneath the glass and the way her mother's eyes had shifted. She pressed her fingers together hard, as if pain could keep her from dissolving into panic. Only then did she notice the portraits on the walls. There were fewer than in the main corridor, but enough to make her stomach tighten. Hana approached one slowly. It showed a young man in clothing from an older century, his expression calm on the surface but his eyes wide with something like trapped fear. The frame around him was metal etched with symbols. Hana leaned closer. She felt it again. A faint warmth behind the glass, and beneath it a low hum that vibrated in her bones. Hana moved to the next portrait. The hum was there too. And the next. Each frame carried presence. Hana's mouth went dry. This was not decoration. It was containment. A gallery built from lives held still. Hana didn't yet understand whether they had been placed there for protection, punishment, or something worse, but she understood that whatever rules governed this mansion, they treated a human soul as an object that could be stored. The door opened without sound, and the Vampire King entered. He did not bring servants with him. He did not announce himself. He simply stepped into the room as if the room had been waiting. The firelight did not brighten his face, it seemed to avoid it, leaving his features carved from shadow and pale stillness. He stood near the window, half lit by the gray daylight that filtered through thick curtains, and watched Hana without speaking. Hana forced herself to meet his eyes. The fear in her body was sharp, but beneath it was anger. A poor girl could be frightened, but she could also be furious. Fury was sometimes the only thing that kept people from collapsing. Hana wanted answers. She wanted to ask why her mother's photo was here, why it felt alive, why the frame pulsed like a heart, why a Vampire King watched her like she was a long-expected guest. But no words came. Not because her voice failed, but because the room itself seemed to thicken around her throat. The mansion's silence was not empty. It was controlled. Hana's wrist tingled suddenly. It was the kind of tingling that made you think of an insect crawling under the skin. Hana's eyes dropped to her sleeve, and she slowly pulled the fabric back. A faint symbol had appeared on her inner wrist. The same snowflake crest. It looked as if it had always been there, hidden and dormant, and only now had sharpened into visibility. The lines were clean and precise, not like a bruise or a rash, but like a brand. It seemed to glow faintly, not with light but with heat. Hana's breath caught. She rubbed at it hard, as if she could erase it by force. It didn't smear. It didn't fade. The Vampire King's posture shifted when he saw it. A subtle tightening, a fraction of movement in his shoulders. Hana saw something behind his stillness, not surprise, not exactly, but confirmation. As if he had expected it. As if the mansion had expected it. Hana understood then that the letter had not been sent to any desperate stranger. It had been sent to someone marked. To someone recognized. The air pressed against Hana's mind, and images rose unexpectedly, not as imagination but as intrusions. Hana saw her mother standing in the mansion years ago, not as a servant or a guest, but as someone who had walked in with purpose. Her mother's eyes were fierce in those images, her posture straight even with exhaustion. Hana saw her mother's wrist bearing the same mark. Hana saw the Vampire King facing her, his presence heavier, younger somehow, but still carved from restraint. Then the images shifted. Hana saw a stone chamber beneath the mansion, a floor carved with symbols, a table stained with old use. She saw her mother bleeding, not weak but furious, holding herself together with stubborn will. She saw another figure watching with calm patience, a man with a faint smile and eyes like polished stone. His gaze was not compassionate. It was hungry. Hana staggered, gripping the back of a chair. The pressure eased, leaving her dizzy. Hana's mind reeled. These were not memories she had lived. They had been pushed into her from somewhere else, delivered in fragments like warnings. The Vampire King remained still, watching her reaction as if measuring how much she could bear. He looked, for a moment, less like a monster and more like someone holding a heavy burden too long. But Hana's anger did not soften. Burden did not excuse silence. Power did not excuse theft of a life. Hana's eyes moved back to the portraits. She felt their hum vibrating faintly through the room. She felt them watching, not with eyes but with presence. The mansion was full of imprisoned souls. Hana's mother was one of them. Hana stepped toward the door instinctively, needing air, needing to escape this room's controlled silence. But when she opened it, the steward stood in the hall, blocking the exit without touching her. His face was neutral, but his gaze carried clear warning: leaving was not permitted. Hana's chest tightened. She realized the mansion was not asking her to stay. It was enforcing it. She turned back, trembling with fury and fear, and the Vampire King watched her with that same stillness. Hana felt, without words, the shape of what he wanted her to understand. The city outside was no longer safe for her, not now that her mark had awakened. There were forces that hunted that mark, and the moment it appeared, she became visible to them. Whether the mansion was a prison or a fortress, it was the only place that could hold off the predators long enough for Hana to learn what she had inherited. Hana refused to accept that logic emotionally, but she recognized its danger. She had lived long enough to know that safety was sometimes the lesser evil. She left the sitting room and went back to the corridor of portraits as soon as she could, driven by the only anchor she trusted. Her mother's frame waited in the same place, lit by pale chandelier light. Hana approached with shaking steps and pressed her palm to the glass. Warmth answered instantly. The pulse beneath it strengthened, matching Hana's heartbeat. A presence brushed against her mind, soft and familiar and fierce. Not a ghost drifting away, but something held in place, compressed and contained, still aware. Hana's eyes burned. Tears rose before she could stop them. Images returned, clearer this time, like her mother was guiding them. Hana saw her mother choosing the frame. Not as surrender, but as strategy. Hana saw her mother carving her own blood into the frame's metal edge, sealing it from the inside. Hana saw the Vampire King placing his hand on the frame afterward, binding it with an oath that felt like iron closing around a secret. Then Hana saw the polished-eyed man again, the regent, standing beneath the mansion, practicing symbols on stone with patient hunger. Waiting. Always waiting. Hana pulled her hand back, breathing hard. Now she understood the shape of her mother's sacrifice. The frame was not merely a prison, it was a shield that kept enemies from extracting whatever power her mother's marked blood carried. But Hana's arrival had changed something. Her mark had awakened. The mansion had opened its gates. The sealed story had begun moving again. And somewhere inside the court, the regent had noticed. Hana felt it in the tightening hum of the portraits. The mansion was preparing for conflict. Hana stared at her mother's face behind the glass and realized a second unbearable truth. Her mother might have been safe inside the frame. But Hana's presence could make the frame vulnerable. And if the regent wanted what was locked inside, he would not stop until he found a way to use Hana as the key. The mansion began to teach Hana its rhythm the way an ocean teaches a swimmer, not with kindness but with repetition. Morning light arrived muted and cautious through thick glass. Hallways stayed dim even at noon, as if brightness was an insult to the building's purpose. Servants moved in patterns that never collided, appearing when something needed to be done and disappearing before Hana could ask anything. Meals came on trays that made no sound against tables. Sheets were changed while Hana was away. Doors opened when she approached, then closed again with soft certainty, reminding her that the mansion was not a place she navigated by choice. Hana stopped trying to demand answers aloud. The house itself seemed built to swallow words, and her rage, though still sharp, did not know where to land. Instead, she watched. She listened. She memorized the smallest details, because she had learned in poverty that details were the difference between control and collapse. The portraits were the hardest thing to endure. Once Hana noticed the hum beneath the frames, she could not unhear it. It was always there, like a low vibration in the bones of the building. In the main corridor it was restrained, kept under tight leash. In quieter rooms it grew slightly louder, as if the mansion allowed the trapped presences to breathe when fewer eyes were watching. At night the hum rose until it pressed against Hana's skull, waking her with the feeling that the walls were full of people who could not sleep. She began to walk the corridors when she could not rest, drawn not by curiosity but by a strange sense of responsibility. She did not know who lived inside the frames or why, but she could feel that they were aware of her in a way they had not been aware of anyone else. Her blood mark burned faintly when she passed them, as if the symbol recognized the symbols etched into their metal edges. The sensation was unsettling, like being noticed by something that had been silent for centuries. Her mother's frame became Hana's anchor. Every day Hana returned to it. She pressed her palm to the warm glass and let the pulse beneath it steady her breathing. Each time, her mother's presence met her like hands reaching through fog. Sometimes the contact was gentle, soothing Hana's terror. Sometimes it was urgent, sending sharp, fragmented images that left Hana breathless. With practice, Hana learned to separate the images from her own thoughts. She learned to recognize when her mother was warning her versus when the mansion itself was responding. She learned that emotion carried information, and that information could be shaped into strategy. Her mother showed her pieces of the past carefully, as if rationing truth. Hana saw her mother arriving here years ago not as prey, but as someone who had chosen a battlefield. She saw exhaustion in her mother's eyes, but also stubborn control. She saw her mother refusing to bow even when surrounded by pale faces and cold smiles. Hana saw blood on her mother's sleeve, not from weakness but from defiance. Then Hana saw the stone chamber beneath the mansion again. Symbols carved into the floor. Tools laid out with clinical patience. Her mother's scarf torn and stained. The polished-eyed man watching from the edge, calm as ice. The Regent. Hana did not yet know his name, but she knew his hunger. It was a presence that felt like a winter wind sliding under the skin. The images her mother sent whenever his face appeared were always edged with warning, the way an animal's muscles tighten before a strike. Hana tried to ask the steward about the Regent without using the Regent's name. She tried to point out subtle things, to indicate the figure in her mind with gesture and expression. The steward remained neutral, his eyes lowered as if Hana were speaking nonsense. But Hana sensed something in his stillness that was not ignorance. It was refusal. The kind of refusal that meant the subject was dangerous. Hana began to suspect the mansion was divided into territories of knowledge, and that servants were trained to protect secrets as fiercely as they protected doors. One evening Hana caught sight of the Regent more clearly than before. She was in a hallway near the library, drawn there by the smell of old paper and the quiet promise of a room filled with human artifacts instead of humming prisons. The hallway was dim, lit by sconces that flickered like they were hesitant. Hana turned a corner and saw him standing at a distance, as if he had been waiting in that exact spot. He did not move toward her. He did not block her path. He simply stood and looked. The look was precise. It made Hana feel measured the way meat is measured in a market. His gaze went to her face, then down to her wrist beneath her sleeve, and then back up, as if confirming something. Hana's blood mark flared with heat so sudden she nearly gasped. The Regent's mouth curved slightly, not a smile of pleasure but a smile of ownership. Hana forced her body to remain still. She had survived years of being dismissed and targeted in small ways. She knew the value of appearing calm when someone wanted to see you break. The Regent's presence lingered for a few heartbeats, then he turned and walked away with smooth patience, as if Hana's fear would ripen on its own without him needing to hurry it. When he was gone, the air felt warmer. Hana leaned against the wall, her wrist throbbing. She understood now that the Regent did not need to chase her. He was inside the fortress. He could watch. He could wait. Waiting was his weapon. That night Hana returned to her mother's frame with shaking hands. The moment her palm touched the glass, her mother's presence surged with fierce urgency. Images poured into Hana faster than she could absorb, the Regent's hands carving symbols into stone, his blood feeding the lines, the same lines glowing, the soundless snap of a seal weakening. Hana saw the Regent's eyes fixed on the frame, on the mother trapped inside, as if he could already taste the covenant power locked within. Then Hana saw herself, standing in the same chamber, her own blood spilling onto symbols. The message was unmistakable. The Regent wanted Hana to open the prison. Not out of mercy, not out of love, but to harvest what her mother had sealed away. Hana pulled back, breath ragged. She pressed her forehead to the glass, forcing herself to think through panic. If the Regent needed her blood, that meant she had power. Dangerous power, but power nonetheless. and power could sometimes be turned against the ones who wanted to use it. Hana began to search the mansion with new intent. She watched where servants were allowed to go. She noticed which corridors the steward avoided. She tracked the times when footsteps sounded overhead and when the mansion fell into deeper silence. She paid attention to the way certain doors seemed to resist opening, as if they were bound by stronger rules. In the library, Hana found a shelf that felt different. The wood was older, darker, and marked with the snowflake emblem so faintly it could be missed. When Hana's fingers brushed it, the emblem on her wrist warmed in response. A book sat there that looked unlike the others. Its cover was black leather with no title. When Hana opened it, the pages were filled with symbols that swam under her gaze like ink in water. Hana's stomach tightened. She almost closed it. But her mother's presence brushed her mind like a steady hand, urging her forward. The symbols shifted. They rearranged themselves slowly, forming words Hana could understand, as if the book responded to her mark and translated itself to the language of her blood. Hana read until her eyes burned. It was not a storybook. It was a record of covenant law, the purpose of the blood mark, the rules governing it, the way it could bind vampires to oaths they could not break. Hana learned that the covenant mark was both protection and target. It granted authority, but authority always drew hunger. She read about vessels, objects designed to hold a human soul in stasis. Frames were the most common, because a frame could be hung in plain sight and guarded openly while pretending it was art. The record described how the strongest vessels required 2 anchors, bloodline and oath. A marked bloodline could tether a soul. A vampire king's oath could fortify the tether into an unbreakable seal. Hana's hands shook as she understood the architecture of her mother's prison. Her mother had used her own blood to tether herself into the frame, making herself unreachable. The vampire king had bound the frame with oath, turning the mansion into the fortress around it. That was why the frame was warm. That was why it pulsed. Her mother's soul was held in a living state, neither released nor dead, preserved by covenant law and royal vow. Hana read further and found the danger. A seal could be weakened from within. If someone marked by the same bloodline offered their blood to the right symbols, they could open the vessel. Not permanently, but enough for extraction. Enough for theft. Enough for a hungry regent to pull covenant power out of a trapped soul like marrow from bone. Hana's mouth went dry. The regent did not need to destroy the fortress. He only needed to turn Hana into the key. Hana closed the book with trembling force. She realized her mother had kept Hana ignorant for a reason. Knowledge was not safety. Knowledge made Hana usable. But ignorance now was also danger, because the regent already knew the rules. Hana left the library and went to the corridor, needing the one presence she trusted. Her mother's frame met her with warmth. The moment Hana touched it, her mother's presence calmed slightly, as if relieved Hana had learned what she needed. Images came again, but now they were clearer and more deliberate. Her mother showed Hana a scene behind the library shelves. A hidden passage. Stone steps spiraling downward. An iron door carved with the snowflake emblem. Beyond it, a corridor lined with older frames and a chamber etched with symbols. The place the regent used. Hana pulled her hand away from the glass, heart pounding. Her mother was not only warning her. Her mother was guiding her toward the source of the threat, toward the place where the regent's power was practiced and refined. Hana's instincts screamed that going there was suicide. But Hana had spent 2 years searching alleyways and basements, walking into danger with nothing but stubbornness. She knew fear's shape. And she knew that fear could be survived when paired with preparation. She waited. For several days Hana watched the mansion's nightly routine. She noticed that servants changed their rounds at a specific time near midnight. She noticed that the court's presence thickened near dawn, as if the vampires gathered when the boundary between night and day was most meaningful. She noticed that the vampire king withdrew into the upper wing before sunrise, leaving the lower halls quieter. On the night Hana chose, the mansion felt unusually still, like a held breath. Hana entered the library quietly. The room smelled of old paper and wax, comforting in a strange way because it was human. She moved toward the shelf her mother had shown her in images. Her fingers found the seam in the wood. She pressed. The shelf shifted without sound, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Cold air rushed up, smelling of stone and iron and dried metallic memory. Hana hesitated at the opening, her heart beating hard enough to hurt. She pressed her fingers to her wrist. The mark was warm, alive, as if reminding her that she belonged to this darkness whether she wanted to or not. She stepped down. The stone stairs spiraled, narrow and steep. The air grew colder with each step. Hana's footsteps sounded too loud in the confined space, but the mansion did not react. It seemed to accept her descent the way a beast accepts its own blood moving through its veins. At the bottom, an iron door waited. The snowflake emblem was carved into its center. Hana raised her hand and placed her palm on the emblem. The door opened. Beyond it lay a corridor lined with frames older and heavier than those above. The humming here was louder, almost painful, vibrating through Hana's teeth and skull. The air felt crowded, thick with trapped awareness. Some frames held paintings. Some held photographs. Some held images that looked like smoke trapped behind glass. Hana moved forward slowly, fighting nausea, fighting the urge to run. She could feel presences inside the frames pressing toward her mark, like plants bending toward sunlight. At the corridor's end was a larger chamber. Symbols carved into the stone floor glowed faintly as Hana stepped closer, responding to her bloodline. A table stood against the wall holding silver instruments and bowls darkened by old use. The stone around the symbols was stained, as if fed repeatedly by blood. Hana's stomach twisted when she saw a strip of cloth on the table. A scarf. Her mother's scarf. Torn, faded, edged with dried blood. Hana reached toward it with trembling fingers. The moment her skin brushed the cloth, an image slammed into her mind with brutal clarity, her mother here, bleeding, jaw set, refusing to break, the regent standing nearby, calm and satisfied, the vampire king arriving with fury that shook the air, too late to stop the choice her mother made. Hana staggered, breath choking in her throat. She clutched the table for balance. Now the truth was complete. Her mother had not simply chosen the frame. She had been forced into the choice by someone who wanted her power and could not tolerate her refusal. Hana's eyes burned. Rage rose hot and sharp. Then the air behind her shifted. Not like a draft, but like a predator entering a room. Hana turned. At the corridor entrance stood the regent. He was perfectly composed, his face calm, his eyes polished and cold. His presence filled the corridor behind him like winter pressing through cracks. His gaze fixed on Hana's wrist with satisfaction that made Hana's skin crawl. Hana realized she had never been alone down here. The mansion had allowed her to descend. The door had opened too easily. This was not a hidden place she discovered. It was a place she had been allowed to enter. A trap built not to catch her body, but to catch her blood. The regent stepped forward slowly, and the frames along the corridor hummed louder in agitation, as if even the trapped souls sensed what was coming. Hana backed away from the table, her heart hammering. The mark on her wrist flared with heat, pulsing like a warning bell. The chamber's symbols glowed faintly under her feet. And Hana understood, with cold clarity, that the regent had been waiting for this exact moment. Waiting for Hana to stand inside the circle where blood could open prisons. Waiting for her to become the key. Waiting for her to make a single wrong move that would unlock her mother's cage from the inside. Hana's breath tightened until it felt like the air in the chamber had thickened into something she had to chew. The regent did not rush. He did not need to. His patience was part of his cruelty, the kind that enjoyed watching fear mature. He stepped forward with the smooth certainty of someone who had rehearsed every outcome and found all of them pleasing. The frames lining the corridor vibrated louder as he moved. The hum rose into a pressure that made Hana's teeth ache. She understood then that the souls trapped down here were not sleeping. They were awake, aware, and terrified, and their fear resonated through the stone like a warning siren. Hana backed toward the center of the chamber, but every step felt like stepping deeper into a snare. The carved symbols on the floor responded to her presence. Faint light crept along the grooves, not bright enough to illuminate the room but bright enough to declare recognition. The emblem on Hana's wrist burned, as if her blood was speaking to the stone. The regent's gaze followed that glow with hunger that no longer bothered to pretend it was politeness. He stopped just outside the circle and tilted his head slightly, studying the way the symbols reacted. Hana realized he was observing her as if she were an instrument. He wanted to see what she could activate without instruction, what her body would do under pressure, what her blood mark would unlock by instinct alone. Hana forced herself not to look at her wrist. She forced herself not to rub it or hide it. She had survived long enough to know that predators watched for weakness, and flinching was a kind of invitation. She scanned the chamber instead. The table. The tools. The bowls blackened by old use. The torn scarf. The corridor filled with frames. The iron door behind her, now shut. The narrow staircase beyond it. The mansion above, distant and unknowable. This place felt like the mansion's throat. A hidden passage where secrets were swallowed and kept. The regent stepped closer again, still outside the circle. His hands remained at his sides, relaxed, but Hana sensed that relaxation was another kind of weapon. It suggested he didn't need to struggle. It suggested he could wait for Hana to move first. Hana's mind flashed to her mother's warnings delivered through the frame. The regent needed Hana's blood. He needed Hana to activate the symbols. He needed her to open a path. That meant Hana's simplest act could destroy everything. A single drop of blood in the wrong place could become a keyhole opening. Hana tried to back away from the circle, but the mark burned hotter as she moved. The symbols under her feet glowed stronger, as if the chamber resisted her retreat. She realized with sudden dread that the circle wasn't merely reactive. It was designed to draw marked blood inward. It wanted her in its center. It wanted her close. Hana's stomach turned. This was why the regent practiced here. This was why he had waited for Hana to descend. The chamber was built to cooperate with her bloodline, to lure her into alignment with its spellwork. The regent's eyes narrowed slightly, as if sensing her realization and savoring it. Hana's survival instincts screamed to run, but running was complicated here. The corridor was narrow, lined with vibrating frames that felt like pressing bodies. The regent moved faster than a human. And the circle itself seemed to tug at Hana's blood. Still, Hana chose motion. Motion was life. Motion broke paralysis. She shifted abruptly, stepping sideways toward the table, putting it between herself and the regent. The regent did not mirror her, he simply adjusted his angle with minimal movement, maintaining the same controlled distance, as if distance meant nothing to him. Hana's fingers brushed the edge of the table. The scarf lay there like a wound. Hana could not stop herself from glancing at it again, and the moment she did, memory returned in a sharp surge, her mother's blood, her mother's defiance, her mother stepping toward the frame as the only remaining escape. Hana's rage rose, hot and pure. The mark on her wrist flared in response, sending heat up her arm like a fuse being lit. The frame's humming intensified. Hana felt presences pressing toward her, like dozens of minds reaching for her blood mark, drawn by recognition. It was overwhelming, like standing in a crowd of strangers and suddenly hearing all of them call her name at once. Hana's knees threatened to buckle under the pressure. Her vision blurred for a moment, and in that blur she saw flashes of faces inside the frames, men and women from different eras, their eyes wide, their mouths frozen, their expressions trapped between fear and pleading. Hana understood then that her blood mark did not belong solely to her and her mother. It belonged to a line that had intersected with countless lives across centuries, lives used as anchors, keys, sacrifices. The regent watched Hana's reaction carefully. He was waiting for the point where the overwhelm would push Hana into a mistake. Hana clenched her fists until her nails cut into her palms. The pain grounded H. It gave her something immediate and human to focus on. She forced her breathing into slower rhythm. She tried to shrink the noise in her head, to push the presences back, to reduce the chamber to one opponent and one escape. The regent stepped forward again. This time he crossed the threshold into the circle. The symbols brightened instantly beneath his feet, but not in welcome. The light flickered unevenly, as if rejecting him. The hum in the frame sharpened into something almost angry. The chamber's air felt like it stiffened around him, resisting. A subtle irritation flashed across the regent's face. Hana realized he could enter the circle, but the circle did not belong to him. It belonged to her bloodline. It would tolerate him only as long as Hana was present and the mark was awake. That meant the regent needed Hana not just for the final act, but for every step. The thought made Hana's mind race. If the chamber resisted him, it could be used against him. The circle was not a neutral stage. It was a machine with loyalties written in blood. Hana shifted her weight and took a cautious step backward. The symbols under her feet responded, glowing brighter where her heel lifted. The light followed her, clinging to her movement like a leash. Hana felt the chamber tug at her, trying to keep her centered. The regent's gaze flicked down to the symbols, then back to Hana with something like satisfaction. He wanted her to see how trapped she was. He wanted her to understand that the room itself cooperated with his plan. Hana's throat burned with swallowed panic. She forced herself to think like someone who had survived not by strength, but by improvisation. She remembered the corridor above, the main portraits, the way the frames there were restrained, the way her mother's frame felt warm and steady rather than frantic. Her mother's prison upstairs was strong because it had the Vampire King's oath around it. Down here, the regent's circle was a tool. It was not the fortress. It was the crowbar. If Hana could avoid becoming the crowbar, the fortress might hold. Hana glanced past the regent toward the corridor lined with frames. The iron door behind her was shut, but she could sense the passage back up. Escape was possible if she could move. The regent moved again, smooth and swift, his hand lifting toward Hana's wrist. Hana's body reacted before thought. She threw herself backward, away from his reach, and her foot landed hard in a groove of the circle. The chamber reacted. Light surged along the carved symbols like lightning along wire. A pulse of force slammed outward, not aimed but explosive, blasting the air with pressure that knocked dust from the ceiling. The frames rattled. The hum roared. The regent staggered back a step, his calm cracking again into annoyance. Hana froze, heart hammering. She had triggered the circle without intending to. Her mark was responding to threat by activating the chamber's defenses. That meant the chamber could hurt the regent. It also meant Hana could accidentally open something worse. The light along the symbols did not fade immediately. It kept flickering as if searching for a stable channel. Hana felt a pull in her blood, a tug toward the center point of the circle. Her wrist burned, and she sensed that the circle was trying to complete itself, trying to lock onto her blood and perform the function it was built for. The regent recovered quickly. His eyes sharpened. He stepped forward again, now with urgency beneath his restraint. Hana understood in a single cold flash that she was seconds away from losing control. The more the circle activated, the more it would demand blood. The more it demanded blood, the more likely Hana would bleed by accident or instinct. She had to leave. Hana turned and ran toward the corridor. The regent moved with inhuman speed, reaching for her again. Hana felt cold pressure graze her back like fingertips. The mark burned fiercely, and the frames along the corridor reacted. Their hum surged into a wave that slammed into Hana's mind, not hostile but desperate. They were reaching. They were pulling. They wanted her to stop, to touch, to unlock. Hana shoved that pull aside with sheer will and sprinted. She made it into the corridor of older frames. The air here felt like water filled with electricity. Every frame seemed to lean toward her, vibrating, aware. Hana pushed through, keeping her eyes on the iron door at the far end. The regent followed, close enough that Hana could feel his presence like winter at her heels. Hana's hand slammed onto the iron door's emblem. It did not open immediately. The emblem on her wrist flared, and heat surged through her palm into the iron. The door resisted, as if testing her bloodline. The regent's presence pressed closer. Then the door opened. Hana threw herself through and climbed the spiral stairs 2 at a time, lungs burning. The cold air rose against her face. The shelf above felt impossibly far. Behind her, the regent's footsteps were too quiet, too controlled. He did not sound like someone straining. He sounded like someone walking, confident he would reach her regardless. Hana burst into the library. The shelf was still open, a dark mouth into the passage. Hana shoved at it, trying to close it, but the wood did not move easily. The mansion seemed hesitant, as if unwilling to hide what was now exposed. Hana's mark flared again. The shelf shifted suddenly, sliding back into place with silent speed, sealing the passage. Hana stumbled backward, panting. The library was quiet, warm, human-smelling. But Hana felt no relief. She could still sense the regent behind the shelf, like a presence pressing against thin skin. She could feel the mansion's tension, as if it understood that something had begun moving that could not be stopped. Hana ran from the library into the corridor, heading for her mother's frame like a drowning person heading for air. Her footsteps echoed. The chandeliers above flickered faintly as she passed. The portraits along the walls hummed in subtle agitation, as if aware that the regent had been near the foundations of their prison. Hana reached her mother's frame and pressed her palm to the glass. Warmth answered instantly. The pulse beneath it steadied her breath for a fraction of a second. Her mother's presence surged with fierce urgency, stronger than Hana had felt before, as if the danger below had shaken her mother's containment. Images burst into Hana's mind, the regent following, the seal in the library weakening, the circle below still glowing, hungry, trying to complete itself through Hana's blood. Hana saw the regent's face close to hers, his fingers reaching for her wrist. Hana saw the frame's symbols flaring. And then she saw something that made her blood run cold. She saw herself here, in this corridor, pressing her hands to the frame, tears falling. And the glass softening. A barrier thinning. Not fully opening, but becoming vulnerable. Hana pulled her hand back in horror. Her mother's presence pressed warning into her mind with sharp clarity. Hana's contact, her heightened mark, her fear and grief, all of it could weaken the vessel. The regent did not need to drag Hana back down to the chamber if Hana could be manipulated into opening the frame from above. Hana's throat tightened. She stared at her mother's photo, at the calm eyes behind thick glass, and felt how fragile the fortress suddenly seemed. Footsteps sounded at the far end of the corridor. Not loud footsteps, not the heavy stomp of a human, but the controlled approach of something that did not need to announce itself. Hana turned her head slowly. The regent stood at the corridor's entrance. He had not needed to chase her through the hidden passage. He had simply taken another route through the mansion, as if he already knew every corridor better than she did. His face was calm again, his eyes polished and cold. He moved forward a step. The portraits along the corridor hummed louder, sensing conflict. Hana's blood mark burned hot, almost painful. The regent's gaze flicked to her wrist and then to her mother's frame with satisfaction that made Hana's skin crawl. Hana understood then that the real trap was not below. The real trap was here, in the corridor, in front of the prison that held her mother. The regent did not need Hana to unlock the door beneath the mansion anymore. He needed Hana to unlock her own heart. He needed her grief to become the key. And Hana, trembling with anger and love, stood between her mother's frame and the approaching regent, knowing that the next choice she made could either protect her mother's soul or hand it over to hunger. Hana felt the corridor narrow around her, as if the mansion had become a throat that tightened when danger entered. The regent approached with the same composed pace as before, but now Hana recognized the shape of his strategy. He was not trying to overpower her physically. He was trying to press her into a choice. He wanted her grief to become movement. He wanted her desperation to become blood. He wanted her to do the unlocking for him, because the only locks that mattered in this mansion were the ones that responded to covenant mark and bloodline. Hana stepped backward until the cold wall touched her shoulders. Her mother's frame was beside her, close enough that Hana could feel the warmth of it through the air without even touching. The pulse behind the glass seemed louder now, not because it had changed, but because Hana's own heartbeat had become frantic and the two rhythms began to echo each other. The portraits lining the corridor vibrated with agitated hum. Hana could feel the trapped presences shifting behind their glass, aware that covenant power had been stirred and that the one who carried it stood exposed. Some of the presences felt terrified. Others felt desperate. A few felt sharp with something like anger, as if even imprisonment could not extinguish resentment. The regent stopped several steps away, far enough that he could appear respectful to anyone watching, close enough that Hana felt his hunger like cold air on her skin. His eyes held no warmth, only calculation. He looked at Hana's wrist as if he could see the emblem glowing beneath her sleeve, then lifted his gaze to her mother's frame with the same quiet satisfaction Hana had seen in the chamber below. Hana understood with sudden clarity that the regent did not need to touch her. His weapon was inevitability. He wanted Hana to believe there was only one way to save her mother and that the only way required Hana's blood to meet the symbols. Hana's throat tightened, not with inability to speak, but with the weight of realizing how easily love could be manipulated into surrender. She forced herself to move away from the frame. Just one step. Then another. It felt wrong, like abandoning someone drowning. But she knew now that the frame was safest when Hana did not touch it. The regent's gaze followed her movement. His expression did not change, but Hana sensed his patience tighten slightly. He wanted her closer to the glass. He wanted her near enough that tears could fall onto it, that panic could make her hands slam against it, that the barrier could soften the way it had begun to in her mother's warning images. Hana's blood mark burned faintly, pulsing as if it were alive. She pressed her palm hard against her sleeve over the emblem, trying to smother the heat. It did nothing. The mark did not respond to pressure. It responded to threat, to proximity, to law. Hana's mind raced. She had learned enough from the covenant record to understand a dangerous truth: a covenant mark was not merely a target. It was authority. It could bind, resist, repel. It could turn old laws into weapons if the bearer knew how to invoke them. But Hana did not know how. She was a poor girl with a mark she had never asked for in enemies who had studied it for centuries. Still, Hana had one advantage the regent did not. Her mother. Her mother's presence was trapped, but it was not powerless. It had guided Hana to the chamber. It had warned her. It had given Hana fragments of knowledge through images. And it was bound to Hana's blood in a way the regent could not replicate, because love and bloodline were both anchors of covenant power. Hana turned her head slightly toward the frame without touching it. The warmth pressed against her mind like a whisper. The pulse behind the glass synced with hers for a brief moment, then slowed deliberately, as if her mother were trying to steady Hana's panic from within. Images arrived, not in a chaotic flood but in a focused sequence. Hana saw the corridor as it was now, the regent approaching. Hana saw the symbols carved into her mother's frame. Hana saw a thin line of blood drawn not on the glass, not on the frame, but on Hana's own emblem. Then she saw her hand raised, palm outward, not touching the frame, but facing the regent. She saw the corridor's portraits dim and then surge with unified resonance, like a choir turning into a wall. Hana realized what her mother was showing her. The regent was trying to make Hana use her blood on the frame. But Hana could use her blood on herself instead. She could activate the covenant mark without feeding the prison's lock. It was dangerous. It was untested. But it was the only move that did not hand the regent exactly what he wanted. Hana's hands trembled. Her palms were slick with sweat. She pressed her nails into her skin until she felt pain, grounding herself. The regent took another step forward. The portraits hummed louder, as if warning her that time was narrowing. Hana inhaled, slow and deliberate, and focused on the emblem burning beneath her sleeve. She pinched the skin above it sharply until she felt the sting of a break. A bead of blood rose warm against the cold air. Hana's mark flared. The regent's attention sharpened instantly, hunger flashing behind his eyes like a blade catching light. He moved faster, closing distance. Hana lifted her bleeding wrist between them, palm outward, not offering it, not hiding it, but presenting it like a seal. The mark pulsed with heat, and the corridor reacted. Not the frame, not the glass, but the air itself. The portrait's hum deepened into a unified resonance, vibrating through the walls as if the corridor had become an instrument. A pressure formed between Hana and the regent, invisible but dense, like compressed wind. The regent's forward motion slowed as if he had walked into resistance. His expression tightened. He tried to push through. The pressure pushed back. Hana felt the mark flare again, answering threat with law. The corridor's portraits vibrated harder. Some frames flickered faintly, their symbols glinting as if awakened. Hana sensed trapped wills pressing toward her, not with hunger like the regent's, but with desperate alignment. They recognized the covenant mark as authority, and in their containment they leaned toward it like prisoners leaning toward a keyhole of air. The regent stopped, his gaze narrowing. He had expected Hana to panic, to rush toward her mother's frame and press her blood to the prison. He had not expected Hana to use the covenant as a barrier. A slow satisfaction rose in Hana's chest, thin but real. For the first time since entering the mansion, she felt not like prey but like someone who could push back. The regent's calm returned quickly, but it was edged now. He shifted his stance slightly, angling his body as if testing the barrier's limits. Hana felt the pressure waver. The covenant force was strong, but Hana's control was fragile. The mark responded instinctively, not skillfully. The regent smiled faintly, not with friendliness but with recognition of an opening. He was thinking, adapting, looking for the loophole. If he could not reach Hana directly, he would turn the environment against her. The corridor's air chilled suddenly. The portrait's humming shifted in tone, becoming uneven. Hana felt it before she understood it. The regent was not trying to break the barrier with brute force. He was trying to destabilize Hana by stirring the trapped presences into chaos. If the corridor's frames surged all at once, the resonance could overwhelm Hana, break her concentration, and force her into a mistake. The humming rose, jagged and discordant. Hana's vision blurred as the pressure of dozens of trapped minds pressed against her own. She felt panic, rage, despair, longing, all of it pouring through her blood mark as if the emblem were a conduit. Hana's knees weakened. She fought to stay upright. Her mother's presence surged from the frame beside her, a familiar warmth cutting through the chaos. The pulse behind the glass strengthened, not frantic but steady, like a metronome. The steadiness anchored Hana's mind. Hana clung to it the way she had once clung to her mother's hand crossing busy streets. The regent's eyes flicked to the mother's frame, irritation flashing. Hana understood then that the bond between mother and daughter was more than emotional. It was structural. It stabilized the covenant resonance. It made Hana's mark respond with coherence instead of chaos. The regent took advantage of Hana's momentary wobble and lunged forward, faster than before, aiming not for Hana's wrist but for the space beside her, toward the mother's frame. Hana's instinct screamed. She reacted without thinking, turning toward the frame as if to shield it with her body. Her hand slammed against the warm glass. The barrier shivered. The warmth surged, and the pulse beneath it thudded hard, matching Hana's frantic heartbeat. The symbols along the frame's edge flared faintly. Hana froze. She had done exactly what the regent wanted. Her panic had turned her into the key. The regent's presence pressed close. Hana felt cold satisfaction in the air, the sense of someone watching a lock finally begin to turn. Hana yanked her hand away, but the damage was already done. The barrier's surface felt softer than before, less like solid glass and more like a living membrane under tension. Hana's breath broke. Her mother's presence pressed urgent warning into Hana's mind. The seal was disturbed. The vessel was vulnerable. Hana stepped away from the frame, shaking, but the regent was closer now, his movements sharp with opportunity. He reached toward Hana's wrist again. Hana lifted her arm to block, and in doing so, her bleeding skin brushed the frame's metal edge. A smear of blood touched the etched symbols. The corridor's light dimmed. Then it flared. The frame's symbols ignited in pale silver, lines of light running along the carvings like fire traveling through cracks. The portraits along the corridor hummed in sudden unified resonance, as if the mansion itself had recognized the beginning of an unlocking ritual. Hana's heart lurched. The barrier softened visibly, the photo behind it rippling like water disturbed by wind. Hana saw her mother's shape behind the surface, no longer flat image but presence pressing outward, eyes wide, hands raised as if pushing against the boundary. Hana's grief surged so violently she almost collapsed. The regent's hunger sharpened, thickening the air. He leaned closer, reaching not for Hana now but for the frame, as if he could plunge his hand through the softening barrier and seize the soul inside. Hana felt something inside her snap into clarity. She could not outpower him. She could not outrun him. But she could choose the direction of the opening. If the frame was opening, it did not have to open into the regent's hands. It could open into Hana. Her mother's presence surged again, not with warning now but with determination. Hana felt her mother's will press against hers like hands guiding her shoulders into stance. Images flashed, not the regent extracting power, but Hana pulling inward, drawing her mother's essence toward herself, sealing it into bloodline rather than letting it spill into the regent's grasp. Transfer. Not full release, but rescue. Hana placed both palms near the frame without pressing into it. She steadied her breathing with brutal effort and focused on the covenant mark, on the blood that linked her to the soul behind the glass. She stopped thinking of the frame as a door. She thought of it as a river dam. And she positioned herself as the channel. The regent lunged again. The corridor reacted. A force slammed outward from the frame, blasting the regent backward as if the vessel itself rejected him. The portraits vibrated in violent agitation. The lights flickered. The regent snarled silently, fury flashing across his face for the first time. His composure cracked. He moved again, faster, harder, less patient. Hana did not retreat. She pressed her bleeding wrist against her own palm, sealing blood to mark. Heat surged through her veins like fire racing down a fuse. The emblem flared bright beneath her skin. The barrier shivered. Her mother's presence poured forward, not fully crossing, but streaming into Hana like warm current. Hana felt memories strike her mind, years of running, hidden rooms, faces of court members, the regent's methods, the king's limits, the laws carved into stone beneath the mansion. Knowledge arrived as sharp clarity, not gentle recollection. Hana staggered under the weight but held. The regent threw himself forward again, and this time he collided with an invisible wall of resistance that erupted not from the corridor but from Hana herself. The covenant mark had become a shield around her body, a boundary of law made palpable. The regent's hands scraped against that boundary and recoiled as if burned. The corridor's portraits hummed in unified resonance, their trapped presences aligning behind Hana's authority like an unseen army. The regent stumbled back, eyes cold with hatred. Hana's mother's presence pressed one final surge into Hana's blood, a seal-like armor wrapping the emblem, a protective barrier designed to make Hana harder to manipulate, harder to use, harder to open against her will. Then the frame's barrier began to harden. The symbols dimmed gradually, as if the vessel was reasserting itself, snapping back toward containment. The photo stabilized. Her mother's image returned to stillness. Hana's breath broke into a sob she could not hold back. She pressed her forehead to the wall beside the frame without touching the glass again. She could still feel her mother inside it, but the connection had changed. It was no longer the helpless ache of separation. It was a bond reinforced. Hana had become a living extension of her mother's protection. The corridor's lights steadied. The portrait's hum lowered from violent agitation into a tense, watchful resonance. The regent stood at a distance now, his composure returning piece by piece like ice refreezing after a crack. His gaze moved from Hana's wrist to the frame and back again, assessing what he had gained and what he had lost. He had not extracted her mother's covenant power. But Hana was no longer ignorant. Hana was no longer simply a key. Hana was now a bearer of covenant knowledge, protected by a seal her mother had embedded into her bloodline in the moment of greatest risk. The regent's hunger did not fade. It sharpened, but it gained caution. He stepped back slowly, disappearing into the dim corridor like a shadow choosing patience again. Hana slid down the wall to the floor, trembling, wrist bleeding lightly. Her mind swirled with new memories that did not belong to her but now lived inside her. She felt the mansion around her shift in response, as if it had registered a change in balance. Somewhere above, deeper in the mansion, she sensed a heavier presence moving, a gravity that made the air tighten. The Vampire King. Hana did not see him yet, but she felt his attention turn toward this corridor, toward the flare of covenant power that had erupted. Hana understood that the king could not ignore what had happened. A covenant seal had been invoked, a vessel disturbed, a region exposed. The court would react. The mansion would react. The hidden war her mother had tried to delay had begun to move again. Hana stood slowly, wiping blood from her wrist with her sleeve. She faced her mother's frame once more, careful not to touch it. The warmth behind the glass remained, steady and reassuring. The pulse was calmer now, like someone resting after exertion. Hana felt her mother's presence pressed gently against her mind, not with fear, but with exhausted relief. Hana realized the final truth of her mother's sacrifice. The frame had not been chosen only to hide a soul. It had been chosen to buy time. Time for Hana to grow old enough to survive the knowledge. Time for the covenant mark to awaken in the right moment. Time for a daughter to become more than a grieving girl. Now the time had ended. Hana turned away from the corridor and began walking toward the heart of the mansion with new steadiness in her spine. She did not know how to defeat a regent who had waited centuries. She did not know how to navigate a vampire court that treated humans as objects. She did not know how to free her mother fully without igniting war. But she was no longer blind. She carried covenant law under her skin and her mother's will in her blood. And in a mansion built to hold secrets from the sun, Hana began to understand that the unbelievable was not only that her mother was trapped in a photo. The unbelievable was that Hana, who had been powerless her whole life, had become the one force in the mansion the court could not easily control. Not yet. And not anymore.